The senator from Vermont.
Thank you. I thank my colleagues, Republican and Democrat, for coming here to the floor today in support of our continued support for Ukraine. I was heartened, Mr. President, to hear today that President Zelensky is on board with the U.S. ceasefire proposal. That's good news. And it does highlight that President Zelensky has shown time and again that he's always willing to negotiate for peace. Putin has always been the aggressor, and that is why I believe we must stand with Ukraine. You know, the question before us today, whether we will continue to stand with Ukraine, has immense implications for the security of the United States, of our European allies, and of world peace. These are critical questions to get right. Should the United States stand by our 80-year-old security commitments in Europe? Should the United States stand behind the rules-based order established in the aftermath of the catastrophic World War II? Or should we abandon those rules despite the fact that they have served our national security interests for so long? Those are the questions. You know, in the aftermath, Mr. President, of the horrors of World War II, in which more than 80 million people died, the United States did establish alliances and security commitments in Europe and determined that this was the way to avoid a World War III. Investments in NATO, armed forces in Europe, and European democracy and economic prosperity. We did not want to repeat what happened after World War I, where none of this was done, and it created the conditions for a Second World War. Perhaps most importantly, America asserted that it would defend a Europe so borders are not changed by force, where nations cannot invade weaker neighbors with impunity. Was that effort worth it in these past 80 years? Since some are now suggesting otherwise, I'd like to mention a few of the reasons why the post-World War II order in Europe, led by the United States and enacted by a treaty in this United States Senate, was a success in keeping the peace. No conflict. Europe has avoided a major war for 80 years. The end of the USSR, Europe weathered the storm of the breakup of the Soviet Union, ushering in new countries committed to democratic values of freedom and democracy. Yugoslavia, Europe and NATO weathered the conflict and the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, demonstrating unprecedented EU-NATO cooperation and commitments in the Balkans to Western democratic values. Our European allies have always been there for us, including in the aftermath of 9/11. Economic values. Our commitments also ushered in the fall of communism and a vibrant European Union that is peaceful and democratic, a club that the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and now Ukraine want into. It's a testament to the success of the painstaking efforts that Republican and Democratic administrations, Republican majority and Democratic majority of a United States Senate adhered to. But these commitments to European security, to NATO, and protecting territorial integrity weren't only good in the past. To say that these alliances and commitments are tired or worn out says that we're tired and we're worn out of peace and tired of maintaining peace for our citizens here in the United States. And that is a fatigue we can never succumb to, ever. Those values are needed today to protect Ukraine in Europe and the United States from a rampant, unlawful, invasive Russia. You know, Mr. President, since the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, along with the rest of Eastern Europe and the Balkan states, has moved rapidly to reorient its politics and policies towards the European Union, toward democracy, toward freedom. It was, in fact, Ukraine's pursuit of a closer relationship with the EU that Putin, the autocrat, used as an excuse to interfere in Ukraine's internal affairs. The invasion of Ukraine also demonstrated the resilience of America's security relationships with Europe and NATO. Never has the European Command of the United States Armed Forces, designed and built to defend Western Europe against a Soviet invasion, has been called upon to coordinate the actual defense of European sovereign borders from the invasion from the east. Today, that's a reality. Europe, also very much our partner, saw the threat and rose to the occasion. In part, and I want to acknowledge President Trump's insistence on this, European countries have begun to increase their defense spending, as they should and as they must. They have done so, and they have stepped up by providing material as we have, advanced missiles, drones, and other military technology for Ukraine. In fact, as a percentage of the gross domestic product, Europe has given more to Ukraine in support and weapons than the United States. We're doing it together. Mr. President, we cannot take for granted that we've had this peace in Europe for 80 years. We cannot take for granted that we did that. It was a result of that sustained commitment of members of this body on both sides of the aisle, of presidents of both parties. Our duty is to keep that alliance united at this stressful time. If Ukraine fails, we should not assume that the European security and our alliances there will survive. World War II ended 80 years ago. We've got to keep it 80 more. The senators that ratified the establishment of NATO and our American European commitments to peace and security on the European continent, they understood that our European alliances are critical to our own security. They would be rightly proud of their success story of 80 years of peace, of democracy, of freedom in Europe. But they'd be horrified at the threat that Putin now poses to Europe, threatening everything that we and those who came before us have worked for. Ukraine's integration with the rest of Europe, their own right to self-determination, Ukraine's battlefield courage, Ukraine's political commitment to democracy and freedom validate the 80 years of America's commitment to creating structures that can enforce and protect peace. Mr. President, turning away from Ukraine now, when it needs us most, could mean the end of that 80-year success story. We must stand by Ukraine and against that unlawful invasion by Mr. Putin. We must stand by our European allies, and we must reaffirm our continued dedication to the work of those who served here before us, to build the alliances, to sustain the alliances that have preserved the peace in Europe. Their future and ours depends on it. Mr. President, I yield back.